All right. Hey, guys, this is Coach Arnie with the Health, Love, and Life Show. And we've been out for a week or so because of Thanksgiving. So we're back. And I'm excited tonight. I've got a wonderful guest that's going to really help us with our brain. And but before that, just remember that you can find me at on Facebook at Arnie Fonseca Jr. and on at Coach Arnie on Facebook as well. You can find me on Twitter at Real Coach Arnie, on Instagram at Coach Arnie F, on TikTok at Real Coach Arnie. Yeah, that's right, TikTok. Get over there, check out my crazy videos, and sign up yourself and start making some crazy videos as well. You're going to get a lot of action over on TikTok. YouTube, I've got some videos there as well. So I'm easy to find. So let's get that going as well. But we're excited tonight because this is a show that we try to cover different areas of our health, our relationships, and life in general. And tonight's guest is a very, very interesting gentleman. His name is Ralph Sanchez. And he's got a master's in Chinese medicine. He's been studying the brain for a long time, almost as long as I have. And I was very, very impressed with his background and his knowledge. And he's going to be able to give us some real good insight on dementia, the brain, Alzheimer's, and strategies on how that we all can get better, especially between the ears. And I guarantee you this, every one of you that's listening right now either knows somebody or is themselves concerned with what's going on between the ears, because that's the one thing, guys, the one thing that we really don't know how to control yet. But we're coming up with some really good strategies. But I'm telling you, the strategies are not going to be from the news media or from modern medicine. The strategies are going to come from guys like Ralph, who's figured this stuff out because it affected him. And so that's where you're going to get some really neat ways that you can get better. So before I keep running my mouth here, let's bring on Ralph Sanchez from the AlzheimersSolution.com. And Ralph, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great, Arnie. Really excited to be here with you and to share the information that you were talking about in terms of controlling our risk for dementia and Alzheimer's as we age.
Why don't you take a couple minutes, Ralph, and share with the audience a little bit more about your background, a little about your bio, and how you came to this point in your life?
Well, my journey in medicine started back in the 90s. In the late 80s, I was actually looking for a new career. I was in landscaping. And my story about landscaping ties into all of this because I was a young man at the time and didn't realize what a certain occupational exposures would be problematic in terms of my health. And I had incurred pretty severe exposures to pesticides because I, again, was young and dumb and didn't realize that exposing myself that way could have some severe consequences. And at the time, those pesticides were laden with mercury. And as the years rolled by, I just was not feeling well. And I was in my 30s. And when I started that career in landscaping, I was in great shape. You know, I had embarked on a health and wellness journey myself and was going to the gym regularly, was really starting to watch my diet. I was a smoker and I had quit and really cut down on my drinking. So I was doing all of the right things, right? Mm-hmm. But when I decided to make a major career change and go into Chinese medicine, I went and discovered that it would be a wonderful way to fulfill some very important points in my life in terms of a vocation and a spiritual path, if you will. And I chose Chinese medicine because of the rich historical, philosophical, and the background it had in terms of the healing tradition of the Far East, which was geared in a holistic model, of course, as we often refer to it. So all of that really attracted me. Dove in head first. I was just really somewhat overwhelmed in my first year because it was just an eye-opener in terms of what it potentially meant for me in my career. And through that journey of getting into medicine and looking for answers to my own health problems, I started to put two and two together and realized that the pesticides and the mercury were big reasons underlying why I was feeling not well. And then I started to put additional information together as to how those issues related to my cognitive health and my brain health as I aged. I ran across a very interesting piece of information. This was already once I was in my practice a few years in the late 90s. And it was around a genetic susceptibility marker to Alzheimer's disease called APOE4. It's a well-validated risk marker for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And I just want to distinguish that just about everything we're going to talk about today in terms of the risk for Alzheimer's disease is geared around late onset Alzheimer's disease. Early onset Alzheimer's disease is pretty much a genetically determined disorder. It's a minor component of the overall cases of Alzheimer's disease, less than 5%. And not all of the genes have been identified, but several are well identified and associated with what's called early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, which means it's inherited, right? Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about is late onset Alzheimer's disease and all the risk factors that are associated with it. So when I came across that information about a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, my eyes popped wide open because it was the first time I had seen that information. And I thought to myself, wait a second, if you can do a test to look at your risk for Alzheimer's disease, a genetic test, why wouldn't you want to do it? And as a matter of fact, as I started to get into the research, the medical community at the time was discouraging that test because he said, well, we don't want to scare people. And we really don't know what to do with this anyway. So they didn't really know back in the late 90s that a lot of these risk factors associated with genetics, environment, lifestyle, diet, that they could be controlled. And so that by taking control, you could vastly reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And that's what I started to find out when I delved into the research. I also had a severe brain trauma when I was a young man, a blow to the head from a automobile accident. And like I said, I was really putting two and two together and realizing that the pesticides, the mercury, the brain trauma really put my brain and cognitive health at risk for a problem later on in life. So I got busy with the research. And that took me into, the turn of the century and got really adept at looking at all of the information related to Alzheimer's disease. And was excited because I started to see that this was a real path for me in terms of a book project that I wanted to do, and also controlling issues related to my own risk in that as well too, and sharing that information with people that I would eventually reach, not only through a book, but through the AlzheimersSolution.com.
Well, I know you've written the book, Ralph. What is the title of your book?
It's the Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease.
Give us the 10,000-foot view of that book. What are the main takeaways there?
Well, absolutely. So the main gist of the diabetic brain and Alzheimer's disease stems from research that I came across around 2005 and 2006. And in 2005, there was a seminal study that coined type 3 diabetes as an aspect of Alzheimer's disease. And what that basically represented was type 3 diabetes as an insulin resistance model in Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated by what that meant. And so I dove into the research, followed it very closely, because after that study, many other studies popped up. And I decided that through that journey and what I was discovering, that this was going to be my book. So my book is very much about brain insulin resistance, type 3 diabetes, and how it relates to type 2 diabetes and the risk associated with that and cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, and I know you and I, when we first talked, because I had studied a lot of work from Amy Berger and some of the research she's done, and it seems like you were doing all that research way back when as well. And but I'm amazed. Well, I'm not amazed that because you already said it, that the big pharma and the powers that be aren't really interested in this stuff. You know, especially I've even had people that I've worked with, Ralph, in some of these centers where dementia was obviously a problem for somebody, and they were more concerned about them having bacon and eggs than having a big hunk of pie with ice cream. How's that?
Well, I understand what you're saying, Arnie. The information around diet in particularly and the risk for certain health disorders has not been the strength of the traditional medical community.
You are very kind, Ralph. You're much more kind than I am.
Well, we've got to be careful sometimes about how we phrase things. Because look, Western medicine is fantastic. Okay, it's fantastic for a couple of things. As a matter of fact, you know this paradigm really well, Arnie.
Yeah.
Functional medicine actually takes the best of Western medicine, which is the science and the technology, and it marries it with the holistic model, which is about taking that information, but not just to arrive at a diagnosis and hand over a drug prescription, but it's to uncover what are the root causes of health issues and how we can address that through lifestyle and diet and supplements. So that's what functional medicine in its essence is. It's a patient-centered medicine where we, look at the person and not just the disease process. The person is first. The disease process just gives us a place to, look at information and to integrate that information into what's going on with the person.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you're being very kind, because you're right. But that's in some ways, in many ways, that's a Eastern medicine or European approach versus, and I may be cutting you off here, so forgive me, but
no,
I think where we do our best job here in this country is saving lives, because there's nowhere else I'd rather be on the planet than right here if I'm in a severe accident. But after that, everything else, it's either equal or we fall behind fairly quickly.
Well, right. As I was saying, the strength of Western medicine is science and technology.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's wonderful stuff, because without that, we wouldn't know anything about how we're approaching certain health disorders and what they mean and what they represent and how we can truly evaluate. One of the central messages in my book is that biomarkers that are available through these assessments, and biomarkers are indicators of your health available through one lab test or another, right? It could be a hormonal test assessment. It could be looking at biochemistry, and or it could be neuroimaging, looking at certain issues related to your cognitive and brain function.
Right. I mean, we have things here, like brain spec imaging,
right?
And we have, all kinds of ability to test if we want to find these things, whether it be food allergy testing and all kind of things that we're able to do now with DNA SNPs and you name it. We can dig if we're curious, right? That's the key word, curious, to find the source of the the discomfort or the source of the debilitation. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's why you're even in this, because you were curious enough to figure out, why am I not feeling good? And why is the traditional medical community not able to help me? And
yeah, well, I already knew Arnie at the time intuitively before I got into medicine. Even though I was not feeling well, I knew that there were no answers in traditional medicine in this country, and I didn't go there. I immediately went to somebody that specialized in functional medicine, and I got a lot of help. But they actually missed a lot of things too, okay? And again, that's what drove me into looking for answers and to start to realize that if I didn't take control of these risk factors, I would wind up like my father, who died of heart disease, my mother, who developed a complication associated with diabetes called metabolic syndrome, hypertension, and she wound up with dementia. So I knew I was on that path if I didn't take control of my risk factors associated with why I wasn't feeling well. And a lot of biomarkers that I was looking at already as far as my lab tests, which I was doing regularly.
Right. Hey, Rob, why don't you explain to the audience here a little bit about chronic inflammation and oxidative stress mechanisms that are central to this situation?
Well, you know, when we talk about inflammation and oxidative stress, they're actually very important components to rest. And they are components to many issues that people encounter in their life, whether it be diet, environmental toxins. And I emphasize that in the book to a great extent. I emphasize, you know, what that means in terms of inflammation and oxidative stress. And a lot of people on your show may have already made the connection of chronic inflammation to their health issues, but a lot of them don't make the same association with oxidative stress, which is not as commonly referred to as a term that's very important in terms of arresting what's going on in your body and your risk for certain issues, health issues, as you age. As a matter of fact, there's a few hypotheses that are termed like the oxidative stress mechanism of aging, right? Which is that, you know, the more oxidative stress is going on in your body, the more rapidly you age. And that's actually a classical model as it's seen in diabetes. It's a form of accelerated aging. So oxidative stress is very important. And what it represents is that you don't have enough antioxidants, you know, either through your diet. Now you also generate, you synthesize antioxidants in your body. So, but the synthesis is largely dependent on your diet, okay? The nutrients in your diet, particularly amino acids. So you have to make sure that you have an anti-inflammatory diet, right?
Right.
And in that anti-inflammatory diet, you're going to be cutting down your risk for all kinds of health disorders as you age. And an anti-inflammatory diet just naturally includes a very healthy spectrum of antioxidants. But supplements can actually be very, very important in that case, because as you age, if you're not eating particularly well, if you don't have a good history of diet, healthy diet patterns and lifestyle patterns, you are going to be running into an oxidative stress problem and a pro-inflammatory problem that's subacute. You really don't notice it. And really, the biggest components to all of this is common issues associated with aging, which is cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, which is very common in the population. And most people are not even aware of it when it begins to take hold in the body. It's not only when it's gone too far that they're eventually diagnosed and they start having to get onto prescriptions to manage the disease process. But just like diabetes and just like heart disease, we now know that Alzheimer's disease has at least a 20 to 30 year time window. So it begins early in life and it starts to manifest in your later 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So you want to start taking control. And that's a central message in my book, that you need to start taking control and looking at these risk factors at midlife at the latest.
Right. Hey, Ralph, hold that thought. Hold that thought.
Okay.
And I want to come back after our quick break here.
Okay.
And talk a little bit about how lifestyle also contributes to inflammation and stress.
Sure.
All right, Ralph, go ahead and finish that point about that. And then I'm just curious, because I know the importance of obviously cardiovascular disease and obviously because it's blood flow. We're dealing with blood flow. But I also know that when push comes to shove, that stress, whether it be emotional stress, physical stress, even as an ultra athlete myself, I know that if I go beyond a certain point of putting stress on my body, what's the term here? Oh gosh, it's like hormetics. Is it hormetics? Where you, like a sauna, if I sit in a sauna for 20, 30 minutes, it's creating enough stress on my body that causes my body to respond to it in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. If I fast, if I do things, if I do cold therapy, if I do enough of something that's hard on my body, but not too much. So if I sit in the sauna too long, I'm going to cook, right? If I put too much stress on my body in an athletic event, I could drop dead. So, but just enough, I will respond to it and build. So, what are your findings on that as far as, blood flow and how it affects the cardiovascular system and the brain in general?
Well, Arnie, I'm glad you mentioned blood flow, because in cardiovascular disease and chronic cardiovascular disease, you start to have problems associated with atherosclerosis, hardening and plaque buildup of the arteries. And that restricts blood flow to the brain, which eventually starts to manifest in a brain problem referred to as cerebrovascular disease, because we have circulation in the brain that's very important as well too, right? Right. And if you're impeding the flow of blood to the brain, and you don't have good circulation in the brain in terms of blood flow and the availability of oxygen and nutrients, then you're really putting your brain at risk for what are called TIAs and strokes. TIAs are mini strokes, and major strokes, of course. And those are big problems associated with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So we talked about Alzheimer's disease, but vascular dementia, which is associated with cerebrovascular disease and can be an overlapping disorder to Alzheimer's disease, is also a very important thing to be aware of, because these become overlapping problems in the aging process. So that's why I continue to emphasize cardiovascular disease and diabetes, because the two go hand in hand as you age. And if you're not taking control of those issues and the risk for that, you're going to be upping the risk for dementia and Alzheimer's disease as you age. And obviously, we want to be doing the opposite. So what this show was intended for is to really discuss about these risk factors and how we can control them, right? So it's very important to control the disease processes that you may not be aware of that are lurking in terms of, the issues related to heart disease and diabetes, okay? Because If you're not going to your doctor frequently and doing evaluations, if he's not proactive and looking at this and being more into a preventive healthcare model, then these things are going to slide and slide and slide until you are diagnosed with the problem. And by that time, guess what? Your brain is already in trouble. And if you have the susceptibility risk factors on the genetic side, then all of that is going to converge into a dementia and an Alzheimer's disease as you age. Now, you talked about stress, and stress is really important. Why? Chronic stress is a brain killer. It kills brain cells, okay? So elevations of stress hormones, particularly cortisol, is well known in the health community, and looking at chronic stress through certain evaluation of these stress hormones, that could be an important component in leveraging and understanding where you stand, because chronic stress over time, actually creates a lot of health issues. It contributes to heart disease. It contributes to diabetes. It's a brain killer. It kills your brain cells. And it's also a very well documented link in the research to Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. Chronic stress is associated with Alzheimer's disease.
Hey, Ralph, quickly, take a minute here. And I'm curious as why the brain possibly can lose the capacity to burn glucose as you age. And how does that increase our risk here for some of these?
Well, that's a great question. And that's all somewhat built into the type 3 diabetes model. Now, when the type 3 diabetes model, which is a brain insulin resistance model, surfaced, it was strictly around the issue of insulin function. Now, first, insulin is critical in brain function in terms of memory and learning processes. So it's a little bit different than in the body. In the body, its essential role is to facilitate the uptake of glucose into the cell and facilitate glucose metabolism, which we all need for energy metabolism, right? But in the brain, it's a different role that it plays. It partially fulfills a role in bringing glucose up into the brain cell. But the most important component is that it's a signaling molecule that's very, very important for the cascade of memory and learning processes that occur in the brain-to-brain communication at the synapses, okay? And at the synapses, we have lots of different types of receptors. The synapses is where the brain cells communicate, where they meet. There's a little gap between what's called the axon terminal and the dendrite. And that's a little synapse, it's a little area. And those little areas between both terminals they're filled with receptors on both sides, the terminal and the dendrite. So they're filled with receptors, right? And the insulin receptor is located right there, along with many other receptors. And I describe all of that at great length in the book. But insulin, when it doesn't function well at those receptors, there's a resistance that builds up due to what's called beta amyloid peptides. Now, these are the proteins that are the precursor to plaque that builds up in the brain. And many people have heard of amyloid plaque, okay? But what I was fascinated by when I started to look at the research in 2001, 2, and 3 around this, because I really dove in heavily to the amyloid cascade hypothesis. Back then, when I started my research, the two main focuses of the cause of Alzheimer's disease was amyloid plaque and another lesion that forms in the brain called neurofibrillary tangles. So we'll just say plaques and tangles, okay? And I have lots of information at the alzheimerssolution.com. And of course, I describe all of this at great length in the book. But before the plaque is building up, you have these small aggregations of beta amyloid protein or peptides that start to build up. And there's small little aggregations that are called oligomers, right? And that means that these peptides are just kind of coming together, and they're small little fractions of 3, 4, 5 assemblies of peptides. And they're attracted to the synapse. So they create great havoc at the synapse. Alzheimer's disease begins with problems at the synapse, because that's where memory and learning processes are initiated. All right.
And let me, forgive me.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Tell us a little bit about, I mean, right now with the ketogenic diet, and seems to be, you know, whether it started with paleo and then it's gone keto, and it's, there's just a lot of misinformation out there. Tell us about ketones and how it works with the brain, and possibility its potential to help with Alzheimer's.
Yeah, well, let me just finish the thought, because I was going to segue right into that.
Perfect.
So what happens when you are not able to utilize insulin in the brain that well? That's a component of the type 3 diabetes model, right?
Right.
But we talked about insulin and the uptake of glucose, which also is important in the brain as well, too, right? Mm-hmm. So, and we also talked about the ApoE4 genetic marker, right? Mm-hmm. So what I started to realize when I was looking at the type 3 diabetes model, and this component wasn't included in the original model of type 3 diabetes, was that there was a huge issue starting to surface in the literature as a risk factor, a significant risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and dementia, centered around brain energy metabolism, right? And that's actually a significant component in my book, right? Now, the brain energy metabolism model is built around a model of what's called neuroenergetics. So it's all about brain energy metabolism and the energetics of our little mitochondria, which are the energy producing little organelles in the cells. And the mitochondrial function and energy metabolism was being looked at as a very, very early component of Alzheimer's disease, and a critical one that happens in what's called the preclinical stage, which is basically the silent stage of Alzheimer's disease. Preclinical stands for no clinical symptoms. And then the preclinical stage is when many things start to come together as problems that raise your risk for Alzheimer's disease as you age. And so a dysfunctional mitochondria, an inability to metabolize glucose, and problems with energy metabolism associated with all of that, was then, after this type 3 diabetes model, starting to surface as significant components to the risk for Alzheimer's disease. So I thought, wow, this is really going to be an important part of my book, because this term, which is called glucose hypometabolism, which wasn't in the original type 3 diabetes model, was starting to surface as a very, very critical component in understanding the risk and onset for Alzheimer's disease and the aging process. And that is why ketones and medium chain triglycerides started to surface as important answers in the issue related to cognitive decline, mild cognitive impairment, which is seen as a transitional stage to Alzheimer's disease, as an answer to those problems, and perhaps even the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. There's even a medical food that's available only by prescription, but it's really no different than many medium chain triglyceride products out there. And it's called Axona, A-X-O-N-A. And it's just a medium triglyceride product that's very, very important to start incorporating as a protocol, into a person's repertoire of interventions when they're diagnosed with any sort of cognitive impairment or early stages of Alzheimer's disease.
Wow. I mean, let's, I mean, you've talked about genetic predisposition a little bit about which, and again, just to reiterate here, you use the term LOAD, which is for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And is that a term you use in your book as well? LOAD?
Yeah, quite frequently, because it's just, it's easier to refer to LOAD.
Sure.
Late onset Alzheimer's disease rather than continuously repeat late onset Alzheimer's disease. So LOAD is an acronym, in the literature and used widely.
Let me jump ahead. I want to jump ahead here and ask you a question that got my curiosity. You made a statement about why do you think there is an increased incidence of Alzheimer's in women, Ralph?
Well, thank you for bringing that up, Arnie. I was hoping we'd get to it because women have almost twice the incidence of Alzheimer's disease over men as they age. And there's some very, very important components to that. So we mentioned the ApoE4 marker and mitochondrial energy metabolism. Now, here's a very interesting fact. We inherit our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers, okay? So whatever mitochondrial health your mother had, she passed on to you. Now, if you happen to also be in the ApoE4 genetic risk profile, and ApoE is the gene, ApoE4 is the variant, so you can be an ApoE2, 3, or 4. And the ApoE4 carries a multitude of risk associations associated with Alzheimer's disease, all right? One of them is the clearance of that beta amyloid protein that we talked about, right? Getting it out of the brain. The other is glucose metabolism. So if you're an ApoE4 genotype, it's referred to, if you're a carrier, you're not burning glucose as well as the next person who's not an ApoE4 carrier, all right? That's a very important thing to be aware of because they have done studies in young people, like adolescents, and shown that their brains have to work a lot harder if they're an ApoE4 carrier. Why? Because they're not metabolizing glucose as well as the other person. So as that, just continuously grows as an issue in the aging process, you become less and less able to burn glucose. And that ties directly into women's risk. So we have the issue of an inherited mitochondrial capacity from our mothers. We have the issue of ApoE4 if we're a carrier. And then women, if you add that at the menopausal transition, if they are shifting into a low estrogen state, that is critical. And it's critical for two reasons. One is that estrogen actually functions as a very important antioxidant in the brain. But just as importantly, the role of estrogen also governs glucose metabolism in women. So that's very, very important to be aware of because if you're starting to dip in your estrogen levels, as you age after the age of 50, and we're talking about women, of course. Now, testosterone can be an issue in men, but not glucose metabolism. But in women, if you're declining in estrogen and you're an ApoE4 carrier and your mother had Alzheimer's disease, well, you have a lot of significant risk factors that you need to be very, very careful with as you age because the science is very clear low estrogen types, women, have an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease once they start getting into their later 60s and 70s.
Hey, Ralph, I've done, brain rehab from a traumatic aspect for a long time. And one of the things I've always been cognizant of and even curious is the concept of neurogenesis, which up until probably 8 years ago, maybe, you may have run into it sooner than that, but I know up till about 6, 7, 8 years ago, people would constantly say, oh no, the brain, that's it, and with the hippocampus and increasing the volume and all that stuff. And then all of a sudden, it was happening on a regular basis and people were reporting on it, although much of the media was not, but that's another story. But neurogenesis is possible, which is developing new brain cells. In your professional opinion, Ralph, what do you think is the best protocol? Doesn't it mean it's an educated guess. The best protocol for individuals to begin developing new brain cells, Ralph?
Great question, Arnie. And it's a very important topic in terms of how we can look at reducing our risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and how we can possibly prevent it. Now, a very important phenomenon that they've seen is in looking at brains through autopsies in people that have passed on, of course, is that a lot of these brains that were riddled with amyloid plaque, well, the individual did not exhibit any signs of dementia when they passed away. So that brought up a lot of questions in the medical community as to the role of amyloid protein and plaques in the risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, let me just say that the role of amyloid and these proteins that I talked about a little while ago, there's no question. There's no question about their role, okay? But they were starting to sort of say, what is the role of amyloid and why did these people not have a dementia when they died, when their brains were riddled with plaque? And that's how Alzheimer's was first discovered, was an autopsy that this doctor named Alois Alzheimer's, right, discovered plaque in the brain of a patient that had died early on in his life. And so that's where the term comes from that doctor. But what is now understood to probably have happened, and there's a very famous study called the Nun study, where they looked at the brains of these nuns that donated their brains for autopsies, as they also, had brains riddled with plaque, but did not show signs of cognitive decline. And the fact is that there are things that you can do in that neurogenesis model that can compensate for a disease process like Alzheimer's disease, which is to build up a cognitive reserve, a brain reserve, if you will, of healthy new brain cells and synapses, which overcomes to some extent the dying cells that are part of the Alzheimer's disease process. So it is very, very important to focus on neurogenesis as you age. And it's a very simple process to initiate because it involves healthy nutrition, healthy lifestyle, particularly exercise, and keeping your brain active and engaged through either social engagement or stimulating exercises that you may enjoy, whether they be puzzles. Now, I just want to address that there's a lot of hype about, doing puzzle and brain games and whatnot to, counter the Alzheimer's disease risk. And that's a little too simplistic. It has to be a well-rounded, model in terms of what you're doing to build up a cognitive reserve through lifestyle and diet and nutrition. And but challenging your brain being in a job, doing some work that really is challenging your brain, where you're having to think through things, is very, very important in keeping your brain active and building new brain cells, because that learning process that you might be engaged in with a job or a hobby or anything like that is stimulating new brain cells.
Hey, Ralph, this has been amazing. We could talk, like you and I were on the phone, we could have talked all afternoon.
Yeah.
Take the last minute here or so and tell everybody how they can find you, how they can get your book, and any other information that you may have that people can research and look up your information and find you as well.
Well, thank you, Arnie. I think you have a little banner there at the bottom that has my contact information. But the best place to get information about what I write and my philosophy around all of this are the articles, videos, and many podcasts I have at the alzheimerssolution.com. The book is available through the website, or you can go directly to Amazon. Just put in The Diabetic Brain, and you'll pull up the book. Again, it's The Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease, and I have another one coming out very soon called The Improved Mind Diet, which is a focus of nutrition, on, this whole model of either neurogenesis or anti-inflammatory approaches. And what we didn't talk about is a very important constituent in all of that, which is referred to as epigenetics, how nutrition, and lifestyle factors can actually trigger your genes to a very healthy expression that counters issues associated with Alzheimer's disease as you age. So that's referred to as epigenetics. And I mentioned that in the book. So again, The Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease, you can go to Amazon or my website, thealzheimerssolution.com. I also have a program that I've developed called BrainDefend. And in BrainDefend, I coach people through all of the things that we've talked about, looking at their risk factors, making the changes that are important to address those risk factors, getting their diet and their lifestyle addressed as well too. And in BrainDefend, I have this one-on-one personalized coaching program that I can share with people if they're interested in learning more about. I do a discovery session where I just have a little informal chat looking at how that might fit for you.
All right. Well, Ralph, amazing information. I know it's this kind of stuff can get in the weeds, but Ralph, you did an awesome job of keeping it pretty simple for folks to understand. And I really appreciate you being here. And I know that you can help people. So guys, get his book and give this man a call if you have questions about you or your loved ones. And I'm pretty sure he can help you out. But we loved having you on, Ralph, and we appreciate you, my friend. And maybe we can do this again and get down in there and dig up, because you've got so much information here. So again, I want to thank you, and we appreciate you, buddy.
Thank you. And I really appreciate being on this show with you, Arnie. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, guys. All right, guys, that's Health, Love, and Life with Coach Arnie, and we are out of here, and we'll see you next week.